You know things about them that most people in their real life probably don't. The way they think through a problem out loud, the opinion they hold that they've never fully explained, but you've heard them circle around enough times to understand, the specific laugh, the reference they keep coming back to, the version of them at 3 in the afternoon versus the version at the end of a long week. You've spent hours with this person. They have never thought about you once. In 1956, two researchers named Donald Horton and Richard Wohl published a paper that tried to name something that was happening with the new mass media of the time. Radio, television, movies. They noticed that people were forming what they called a sense of friendship with the figures that they watched and listened to. Not a confused sense, not a delusion, a genuine feeling of familiarity and intimacy, oriented towards someone who had no idea that they existed. They called it parasocial interaction, intimacy at a distance. The term was new, but the feeling wasn't. People had always done this with public figures to some degree, but mass media industrialized it, made it available daily, at home, with the same person returning at the same time, speaking directly into the room. Horton and Wohl's core observation was precise. The conditions of a parasocial relationship closely resemble the conditions that normally produce a real one. Repeated contact, consistent presence, someone who speaks to you directly, personally in an intimate register, who shares their thoughts and doubts and observations, who responds to what you're experiencing by naming it before you do. The problem is that historically, when all those things were true, the relationship was real. That combination of signals had no other meaning. There was no such thing as one-sided familiarity before media existed. A face you saw repeatedly was a face that belonged to your world. A voice that you recognized was a voice that recognized yours. The brain was built inside that reality. It wasn't built for the version where the familiarity only runs one direction. So it responds to what it recognizes: repeated exposure, consistent presence, direct address, someone speaking as if they know you, or at least know the kind of person likely to be listening. Researchers who looked at this more recently found something that initially sounds strange but makes more sense the longer you sit with it. In one study, people rated their parasocial relationships with YouTube creators as more effective at meeting certain emotional needs than relationships with in-person acquaintances. Not as effective as close relationships, but more effective than the people that they actually knew but weren't particularly close to. Which means the feeling isn't a pale imitation of connection. In specific ways, it competes with real connection. It does some of the same work. Another study found that forming a parasocial relationship with a creator who discussed mental health openly actually reduced the prejudice that participants held toward mental health issues. The bond changed something real. The one-sidedness didn't make it inert. This is the part that is easy to get wrong. The easy version of this story is that parasocial relationships are a problem, a symptom of loneliness or confusion, that people who feel close to creators or podcasters or characters are mistaking fiction for reality in some embarrassing way. But that framing misunderstands the mechanism. The brain isn't making an error when it generates these feelings. It is running the only process that it knows. When something looks like intimacy and sounds like intimacy and shows up with a consistency of intimacy, the brain generates a response proportional to intimacy. That's not a malfunction. That is the system working exactly as it was built, inside conditions it was never designed to anticipate. The attachment is real, but what it's attached to is just different from what the feeling was built for. There's one more thing worth naming before this ends. You are doing this right now. There is a voice that you've been listening to for the last several minutes, a voice that speaks directly to you, that seems to know what you're thinking before you finish thinking it, that shows up consistently, sounds familiar, and addresses you as if it understands something about who you are. That voice does not know you exist, and yet something in you has been responding to it the whole time. Maybe not dramatically, but something, a feeling that's adjacent to recognition, to being known. That is the feeling Horton and Wohl were writing about in 1956. It hasn't changed. You're just more surrounded by it now than anyone in 1956 could have imagined.